Um, but I've said a couple of times so far about a meeting that I had with my rabbi many years ago. This was after about my first 6 months in the pulpit upon graduating. And you may or may not know this about me. I came to Jewish observance rather late in my life. I didn't grow up knowing what the kids here know about how to lead services and what our traditions were and what our prayers were. I learned a lot of that stuff when I was in my 30s and caught up over the course of rabbinical school. And by the time I graduated, I barely knew how to lead services. And then I just worked my tail off. I'm not bragging. I was kind of colbo in a small synagogue, and I was leading the whole service, page 10 to page 514, every single weekend. And over about 6 months, I felt like I started to get good at it. Right? When you really focus on something, you feel competent after a while. And I remember the moment where I was leading services, and it felt amazing. I didn't screw up too much. I called all my page numbers correctly, which I still don't do here. I recognize that. It just felt wonderful until I looked around at the congregation and realized that these prayers that I'd been working on for years to master weren't working. They weren't working for the people in the room. The people still looked bored. I mean, they were there, they were there because they felt strongly about being in a holy place on a holy day, and they were there to support each other, and God bless them, they were there to support me, but they weren't getting into them the way I was getting into them, and I felt at that moment, right after feeling like a complete success, a complete failure, because I look around, I say, we made Minyan, but there's 2 people who are really getting into these prayers. Later, I realized it was actually only one person, but the other guy was being polite because he was a friend of mine. So what did I do? I went to my rabbi. I went back to the Ziegler School. I went to my advisor, Rabbi Aaron Alexander, who's now co-leading a community in Washington, D.C. But then he was in his office, and I was scared because I go to this guy, and he was also my thesis advisor in halakha, in Jewish law. So this guy was no slouch, right? And he loved services, and he loved the rules of services. And I felt I had just gotten up to his standard, and with great fear, I went to him and said, I'm doing it the way you told me, but I have to say it's failing people. What am I doing wrong? And that's when he said to me what I said earlier today and last night. In that moment when you're singing a song that everybody knows, it could be Happy Birthday, Take Me Out to the Ballpark, Adon Olam, whatever. That moment where people feel connected in their hearts to everybody else singing, even if they don't really know the words. And I said, yeah, I know that moment. I've been to birthday parties. And he says, you need 2 of those. If you have 2 of those heart-connected moments with everybody in the room, and you teach a little Torah in between, that's a service. I was shocked. Right? I was trained, page 10, page 514, everything in between, 2.5 hours flat. Right? Maybe 250, maybe you go to 12:15 if there's a bar mitzvah. And I went to Mr. Buy the Book, Mr. According to Hoyle, and he says, you need to play jazz with it. I'm like, what are you talking about? He says to me, what do you think Rabbi Akiva would say? Everybody here know Rabbi Akiva? He hasn't been here lately, but Rabbi Akiva was this rabbi of the Talmudic period. He was sort of an inheritor of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, one of the people who basically rebooted Judaism about 2,000 years ago. He said, what would Rabbi Akiva say if he popped up out of the ground outside Temple Beth Am in Pico Robertson, and he walked into the service, and he came out, what would he say? I said, I have no idea. He said, he would be ticked. What are you talking about? He would be angry. John, he would say, me and my buddies invented this service from whole cloth because we had an emergency. We had a crisis. The temple had just been destroyed. Our line to the Holy One had been cut. The way we knew how to talk to God, which was by killing animals in a particular place, was over. But we had all these people that we loved, and we wanted them to keep getting back together. and keep learning about the values that we shared. So we came up with a brand new service, right? We came up with praying and studying instead of killing animals. And we would, just so that people were kind of familiar with the format, instead of every time where we would do a sacrifice, instead we'll do an Amidah, right? That's why we have 3 Amidahs a day, because we used to do sacrifices in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. And on holidays, we would do an additional one, or a Musaf one in Hebrew. And on Yom Kippur, we would do 5 of them. That's why we have the most Musaf. We have the most Amidahs on Yom Kippur. Right? We invented this service to meet the needs of a crisis 2,000 years ago. Are you telling me that nothing in the world has changed that has affected the Jewish people severely in the last 2,000 years? And he says, this is my chizuk to you. This is my encouragement to you. You know the scales. And if it means saving Judaism for the Jewish people, play jazz. Get creative. Now, earlier in the season, I introduced kind of the theme of our High Holy Days here. It is the resilience that we have, that the tradition gives us, to endure and come out flourishing in times of change. The things from the tradition that let us do this are our diversity, our creativity, our humility, our chutzpah, and our ability to heal. Our ability to heal relationships through tshuva, through repentance, and forgiveness. Today, we're talking about Jewish creativity and how I believe that it'll be critical to our flourishing as individuals in this holiday season, and critical to our thriving as a Jewish community in the future. In a symposium on Jewish ideas about creativity, Dr. David Weiss, who is a professor emeritus of immunology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a scientist, said, there is an intimate, causal relationship between Jewishness and creativity. The commitment is imprinted deeply in the character of the Jew. It remains even when all other marks of Jewish identity have faded. Science is the intellectual struggle to comprehend the physical world and the utilization of the knowledge gained for practical effect. According to Dr. Weiss, it's not by chance that so many of the founders of modern science have been Jews. The imperative to aggressively engage with the world lies at the core of the Jewish ethos. The engagement is dialectical, a constant weighing of ends and means, a constant challenging of canon and dogma. Its purpose is clearly defined, the unrelenting improvement of human existence. This is not a utopian engagement. It is immediate and it is inclusive. To act, to do, to create. The possibilities are unlimited. Nothing substitutes for this imperative. No declaration of faith. No ritual performance. The commitment to life and creativity is the irreducible sacrament of Judaism. Shnei Amar, Dr. Weiss. I'll add, not for nothing, what's the first verb that appears in the Torah? Bara. Create. Now, it's a special verb. For the grammarians out there, it's a special verb form. Bara is a word, the verb, the only subject it has, the only subject of this verb is God. Right? When God creates, God baras. Or God gods God's self, as some people have said. But it's also important to note that in the Jewish reading of our creation story, we don't look at it traditionally as a creation ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing. It said God saw the world was unformed and void. It didn't say it didn't exist. It was just a mess of water and other matter. God was not inventing matter. It presupposes that this matter was tohu vavohu. It was in chaos. And God's way of creating was simply adding order to that chaos, taking what was already present and making a whole new presence. And that is our universe, or the current iteration of it. And you can see how Jews, in the image and imitation of God, have similarly applied order to chaos in a creative way in order to preserve our deepest values and our identity as a people in a time of great change. For example, there's a rabbi named B'nai Lappi. Rabbi B'nai Lappi leads a very progressive yeshiva called Svara. And in her Eli talk, that's like a TED talk for Jewish people, in her Eli talk, which she called An Unrecognizable Jewish Future, a queer Talmudic take, she describes a particular process of Jewish creativity. But first she lays out a little bit of sociology for us. For every people, every tribe, every group, every institution, every gathering, we have a master story. Think about the groups that you're a part of. Every group has a master story, and that master story has to answer three fundamental questions. Who am I? What do I believe? And how am I going to live my life? For example, our master story is Torah. But every master story inevitably faces what she calls a crash. Right? There's some event that happens, and the master story no longer works because of external changes. We're invaded by somebody, something's destroyed, or for internal reasons. We change as we grow, as we learn, as we come to new countries, as we go from deprivation to freedom, or back to deprivation again. We change, and we have different needs. In our example, our master story crashed with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Roman Empire. Right? Our master story contained us getting together at fixed times of year. For example, what we read in Pinchas out of the Persian Torah. We got together at fixed times of year, and we did a certain thing, and that's how we connected to God. That's how we cleansed ourselves of our errors, and that's how we saw our friends once or twice a year. But without the temple, we couldn't do that anymore. We crashed, and we had to figure out what to do next. And Rabbi Lappi says every time we have this kind of crash in a people's master story, there are three and only three possible responses to this. And if anybody likes sociology of religion, Peter Berger does a great job talking about this as well. But for Rabbi Lappi, the crash has three options. Option one, deny the crash. Pretend as if nothing has happened. Go about your business. Build a wall around your story and defend it relentlessly. In our example, these were the Tzedokim, the Sadducees, right, who happened to be the priests of the temple. Often the people who take option one, deny the change, are the people who are employed by the master story. And they have the most to lose. So that's option one. Option two is accept the crash, reject your master story altogether, and move on to embrace a new master story. There was something very popular going on back then called the Roman Empire. I was listening to another book on tape the other day. It was the Roman Empire comprised over 100 million people at one point, based on tax records. It was a very compelling story. And Rabbi Lappi says by academic estimates, fully 90% of Jews at this time stopped being Jewish. If you could imagine this, 90% of the Jews in the world stopped being Jewish. And they were absorbed into the Roman Empire through assimilation or through just trying to get through their day. But that 10% took option three. Remember, option one is deny the change. Option two is accept the change and reject altogether where you were coming from. Option 3, for the weirdos, return to the master story. Keep what works. Remember the scales that you learned in music class. Maybe you change your instrument. Maybe you change your tune. But you keep what works. You keep the values. You keep the part where it says, you shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. And you don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. We can't do the part where it says, on the 7th day of Shavuot, kill 3 bulls. I'm just kidding. There's only 2 days of Shavuot. But you keep what works. You hang on to the values. You hang on to the identity that you have with your community around you. You take your scales and you play jazz until a new master story is synthesized. These were the fringe Jews, many of whom had remained in Babylonia after a previous exile when we lost the first temple, and they'd already begun to try different tunes. But what they built from the ashes and the rubble of the second temple was ingenious. Not only did they provide us with a new master story as a solution to the crash of the loss of the second temple, replacing sacrifice with prayer, study, acts of kindness, and an injunction toward tikkun olam. Not only did they keep that, but they built in to the master story a way to deal with future crashes. They said, rather than being rigid and inflexible in adhering to our master story and the way things have always been done, they agreed that the future operants, the future players in this new story, could change. They could change things. They could reinterpret. They could remix. As long as these players were both, according to Rabbi Lappy, Gemirna and Sevirna. These are Aramaic words. Gemirna means, gomer is like completion, right? If you're going to play jazz, if you're going to help change the story, you have to be steeped in the tradition that you're already from. You had to keep learning. You had to understand why we did the things that we did, even if we can no longer physically do them. But you had to stay immersed in Torah, and you had to be completely devoted to the people. That's Gemirna. Sevirna, in Aramaic, is sort of directly translated as reason, but Rabbi Lappy extends it to reason and moral intuition. Right? If you're steeped in the tradition, you are allowed to use your brain and use your heart and change parts of the tradition that are failing people. If you are dedicated to the tradition, you get to be creative based on your own reasoning from your learning. And it's the learning that actually informs your reason and your moral intuition. This is what Rabbi Akiva did. And this is what my rabbi charged me to do in that moment, and I was terrified. But as I walked to shul one morning, I said, I have the keys to this building. And if I fail, there aren't a lot of witnesses. We're barely making minyan back then, right? But it's because we get from our tradition, if we have Gemirna, if we have dedication, and if we have Sevirna, if we are willing to exercise our moral intuition, we get to change. And what I challenge you to do, starting with answering this question, what is our crash today? Given that crash, who is most drawn to option 1? Denying, building a wall, digging in. Can we accept the consequences of option 2, of chucking the whole thing, of throwing out the baby with the bathwater and starting over from scratch? And what might option 3 look like? A couple of years ago, some of my rabbinic colleagues were circulating an email that I don't know how he found this because he's not a golfer, but he got an email from a country club that had an article in the country club newsletter. It was actually an association of country clubs. And I don't know if anybody here plays golf. I know Burl plays golf. But there was an article in this association of country clubs, and it was a lot of like hand-wringing going on. And they said, you know, all country clubs are challenged right now. Membership is on the decline. People aren't coming to our programs. We've got to find new ways to attract the young families. Does any of this sound familiar yet? You could do a find and replace in this article for church, synagogue, Rotary Club, Elks Lodge. And I say church because while we see synagogues closing by the dozens each year, churches are closing in the thousands for the very same reason. This is our crash, right? Our crash is people are using institutions and rituals differently than they used to maintain community. We don't not need community anymore. But the way we've been using institutions and certain programs and rituals to maintain that community is failing us. I want to share with you, finally, that creativity is not only critical for community resilience, but I'll say individual and interpersonal resilience and growth as well. In Masechet Tanit, in the Talmud, rabbis are having this discussion about the relative merits of two types of plants, the cedar and the reed. The cedar is tall and strong. We built the first temple out of it, for crying out loud. But it has a weak root system. And as strong as it is, if you have a gale force wind, it will knock a cedar right over. Reeds, on the other hand, are small and skinny. You wouldn't build a temple out of one, maybe a sukkah. And when winds come, all the reeds are bent all the way down back into the water, but when the winds stop, they pop back up because they're flexible with deep roots. I promised Eric I would call out the movie Dune. You know, as Paul Atreides is fighting Sting, he only wins when he says, "I will bend like a reed in the wind. I will be flexible in order to triumph against great strength." And in Masechet Tanit, they give it a different example, though. Not about institutions, but about two people. A person should always be soft like a reed, and he should not be stiff like a cedar. An incident occurred in which Rabbi Elazar, different guy, Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, came from the town of Migdal Gador, from his father's house, and he was riding a donkey along the banks of a river. So this is a pretty accomplished rabbi. He was very happy, and his head was swollen with pride because he had studied much Torah. He happened upon, in his travels, an exceedingly ugly person who said to him, not naming names, he said to him, "Greetings to you, my rabbi," said this person. But Rabbi Elazar did not return his greeting. Instead, he just said to him, "Reka, what a worthless person. How ugly is this man? Are all the people in your city as ugly as you?" Oh, shocking, right? The man said to him, "I don't know, but you should go and say to the craftsman who made me, 'How ugly is this vessel you have made.'" When Rabbi Elazar realized that he had sinned and insulted this man merely on account of his appearance, he descended from his donkey, prostrated himself. That's like what we did yesterday, and we're going to do a little bit later. He prostrated himself before him, and he said to the man, "I have sinned against you. Forgive me." And the man said to him, "I will not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and say, 'How ugly is this vessel you have made.'" For the rest of the trip, Rabbi Elazar walked behind this man, trying to appease him until they reached Rabbi Elazar's city. He was coming home. The people of his city came out to greet him. "Greetings to you, Rabbi Elazar, my rabbi, my master, my master." The man said to them, the other guy said to him, "Who are you calling my rabbi, my rabbi?" They said to him, "To this man who's walking behind you, Rabbi Elazar." And the man said, "If this man is a rabbi, may there not be many like him among the Jewish people." They asked him, "Why do you say this?" And he said to them, "He did such and such to me." He told them the story. And they said, "Even so, forgive him, for he is a great Torah scholar." And the man responded, "For your sakes I forgive him, provided that he accepts upon himself not to become accustomed to behaving like this." Immediately, Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, entered the study hall and taught, "A person should always be soft like a reed and not be stiff like a cedar, as one who is proud like a cedar is likely to sin. And therefore, due to its gentle qualities, the reed merited that a quill is taken from it to write Torah scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzot." In another story, Rabbi Akiva, talking about him a minute ago, Rabbi Akiva, who started to learn Torah at the age of 40, by the way, he was completely illiterate till he was 40 years old. But one day he walks into a cave and he sees water dripping on a stone, and the water had worn a hole through the stone. And he said, "Surely water, which is soft, if water can carve hard stone, then Torah, whose words are as strong as iron, can penetrate a heart that is made of flesh and blood." And thanks to Rabbi Elazar, we know that these words of Torah, strong as iron, have been transmitted generation to generation for thousands of years by a reed, because it bends in the wind, only to stand tall again long after the cedars have fallen. So let me ask you, when you look at the relationships in your life today, where is your crash? With whom has your story changed irrevocably? Maybe they changed, or maybe you did, or maybe something happened, and now things will never be the same. Will you take option one, deny the new reality, nurse the grudge until one of you forgets? Will you take option two, sever the relationship entirely, letting go of all the good that you shared, and move on without that relationship in your life? Or will you take the harder, more rare, but more enduring path of writing a new story together, hanging on to the good of what you wrote together in the first place, and write a new chapter and move forward together in a new way? This, too, takes creativity. And it's the kind of creativity that this season calls for. To endure as individuals and to endure as a people, sometimes we have to get weird. Sometimes we have to take our old scales and play new jazz. This is the spirit in which I believe King David said to us over and over again, and even in our service today, Shiru Ladonai Shir Chadash. Sing to God a new song. I don't know what that song's going to sound like, but I feel really good that we're going to be singing it together. Shana Tova Umetuka.